네, 안녕하십니까. 정보통신산업진흥원장 박수영입니다. 예, 이 시간에는 핀란드의 기업 전략 전문 컨설팅 기업을 운영하고 계시는 페르스테니우스 박사님을 모시고 핀란드와 한국의 창조경제에 대해서 이야기를 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. 또 한국에 지금 그 한국 사무소를 운영하고 계시기 때문에 이 핀란드와 한국의 두 나라의 이런 창조경제에 대해서 많은 깊은 이해를 하고 계십니다. 예, 그러면은 이야기를 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. Dr. Stenius, Finland sounds kind of very foreign to Korean. I mean, only thing we know is like a sauna or xylophone. You know, and Nokia was famous to Korean. But however, even though we feel very foreign, but I noticed that there are a lot similarity in terms of cultural and education. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about the kind of a similarity between two countries?
Yes, of course. Perhaps you also know Santa Claus comes from Finland.
Yes,
so that may be another thing that people know. For sure, there are many similarities between the countries. For example, education. Both of these countries, although they are quite small, relatively speaking, have succeeded very well in the PISA tests and other global benchmarking tests for education. So I think in both countries, educational system and education in general has a high value, and the countries are focusing on that. Now, the style of education is very different. Korean style, of course, means a lot of hard work and going to evening school. Yeah. The Finnish system is quite a lot more liberal and emphasizes more the creative thinking. Both of these countries also share a political background in the sense that they are surrounded by very powerful neighbors. And in fact, Finland was invaded both by Sweden and then later by Russia. And similarly, Korea has a similar history. Both have also a history of war, and the war was devastating for both countries. And these two countries managed to build a very strong industrial infrastructure from that. So I think we share a lot of historical and political background and also the same values. These two countries being very small, I think the people in these countries have recognized that importance of education and that all the population gets educated is quite important for their success. So I think there also we have a lot of commonality.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, as you know, Korea is moving toward becoming a kind of innovation society. So with an emphasis on creative economy. Are there any lessons we can learn from Finland?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as you know, we had a big crisis in Finland due to a Nokia collapse. Yes. It lost its leadership position. And at that time, people were very worried what would happen to Finland. However, there were already signs about change earlier. When there was the internet boom in the late 1990s and 2000, the first startups that were quite successful came about. At that time, because Nokia was so strong, this creative economy was not emphasized. But I think the root was laid at that point. When Nokia then lost its position, these companies who had been developing underneath started to flourish. And I think just recently, last week, there was an article in Joseon Ilbo where some of the companies were mentioned, like Jolla and Supercell, which now are growing very rapidly. Of course, many Koreans also know the Finnish gaming company Rovio, which is quite popular with the Angry Birds game. So I think these companies really have come out. But even though it appears that they appeared in the last few years after Nokia collapse, to be honest, these people who are behind these companies, the entrepreneurs, they were already active in early 2000 and late 1990s. So the roots are far back in the history.
I see.
What I think we can learn is that it takes a long time to create this kind of economy. The other thing that we've noticed was that the large companies are not necessarily supporting that kind of economy. When Nokia was there, I don't think it actually helped the startups. In fact, it may have slowed down the development of the startup. And only once that company collapsed from its leadership position, these younger companies were able to grow out. So from that respect, I think that one of the lessons is that it's very difficult to build an creative economy as long as some companies dominate the economy and are the big leaders.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, what is the effect of a collapse Nokia on Finnish economy?
Well,
it had
it had multiple effects, and also, of course, that collapse coincided with the global financial crisis as well. So there was a double whammy, so to say. Of course, the changes had already happened before. We had a strong electronic industry which grew up together with Nokia.
Yeah.
And as Nokia became more successful, it started to outsource its production further and further away. So the electronics industry had already started to disappear, the manufacturing part of it. There was still a lot of software industry, but still outsourcing was happening all the time. And I think in Finland, we already saw that although Nokia was still leading, a lot of the effects were seen on a global scale, not anymore so much in Finland. When Nokia started losing its position in Finland, the two big cities which Nokia had been supporting, which is Salo and Oulu, they were the first ones to suffer because the research and manufacturing started to go down. So I think that was a big effect. And of course, the government was very worried because our gross national product started dropping as well, and our exports started dropping.
Yeah.
So there was a clear impact. And a lot of the engineers lost their jobs. So this also was a big impact. And because Nokia was a world-leading company, there was nobody else in the country with similar jobs. So these people had to find completely new types of jobs. That was what happened with the startup community as well. Then these people started looking for entrepreneurial opportunities because not all of them could find jobs in the industry. So they had to start thinking about startups and entrepreneurial ways of making a living.
So like a risk make a new opportunity.
Yes, I think that. So I think that there was two things. First of all, Nokia collapse caused a big concern around the whole country. Politicians, academia, industry, everybody were worried. And that united them. So there was a time where the country really was looking for solutions together. And the funny thing was in the government, this was the first time we had a left and right government together with the prime minister and the finance minister being for these two opposite parties. And they even collaborated. And people were surprised to see this kind of thing. But I think the reason was the crisis. The crisis really brought the people and the political parties together, and they started working for joint solutions, which everybody could support. And that, I think, was an important factor.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I think the kind of transition between Nokia era to the post-Nokia era, government role must be very important. So what was the government role and what is government policy to kind of change the transition between two eras?
Like I mentioned, the roots were actually already before in the early 1990s and the late 1990s with the telecom bubble. But government had this organization called TEKES, which is sort of like an technology funding agency. And TEKES has had this role over decades already, supporting new technology development. They work both with large companies and small companies. But really, and that was the time in the 90s. In the late 90s, when the telecom bubble appeared, Finland was leading in mobile technology. So a lot of startups came about in the mobile and wireless arena. And that time, TEKES started its systematic funding of these companies, providing research money and for risky projects. They were the key agent. There were also other agencies like Finnvera and Teollisuussijoitus who supported this development. But these agencies were created by the government and supported by the government. And they played a big role in creating the ecosystem. Now, one of the problems in this kind of situation is that the government often pours a lot of money into the ecosystem and much of that money is wasted. And I think that was a concern after the telecom bubble burst, that many people were criticizing these organizations for wasting the money and funding too risky projects and so on. But I think that without these kind of agencies focusing on risky projects, you never get new technology. So you have to have some learning like that. However, the government looked at the situation very carefully during the 2000s, and they started restructuring. So the feedback from the ecosystem was that the system is too complicated, too many agencies overlapping, too much money flowing in uncontrolled way. So in the late 2000s, the government started restructuring the agencies. And they did some very strong moves. So I think there was also some courage involved in how they thought they could help this. Of course, there were also a lot of educational programs and other things which are typical. A third element which is very important was the government started changing legislation. So legislation and has multiple effects. It has taxation effects, but also IP and intellectual property effects. But the area, intellectual property in Finland is well protected. So from that perspective, there was not much need to change those areas. But taxation, and especially venture capital and business angel taxation was changed, which meant it was more favorable for business angels and venture capitalists to take on risky projects and to finance them. This way, the government agencies like Tekes and the private sector got together and they started working together for the investment. For example, Teollisuussijoitus, which is a government agency, they were always happy to match the private funds, but they required that the private investor takes the main risk and the lead investment cycle there. So I think the government did many smart things and many courageous things. They looked at the feedback, they looked at the results, and they changed the system gradually to match a better solution.
I see.
And I think this is important when you look at this kind of situation, that there is an evolution, and that evolution will take 10, 15 years. But the government has to be active throughout that and really carefully scrutinize whether the actions it's taking is correct or not.
I see. Yeah, I mean, sounds like the government did a really terrific job in transition between Nokia era to post-Nokia era, and government agents called Tekes really did a good job. Also, I'm kind of impressive about the Congress support. I think the kind of three parties really work together and successfully make a good ecosystem in Finland. Okay, so in that sense, I feel like Finland is kind of few steps ahead in terms of creative economy. So can you give us any things we can learn from the Finland movement to the creative economy? Any caveat we can learn, or any mistakes we can learn from the Finland policy?
Well, you are very kind when you mentioned the success of the government and Tekes. Of course, even in Finland, there was a lot of criticism to these agencies across the time. And we have a parliament and a multi-party system. So there are several parties who have disagreed with some of the actions. But the main parties, definitely in the last few years, surprisingly enough, have been able to keep together and work together for... Of course, in the daily press, we always see arguments. So it's not an easy path. But if we talk about the lessons learned, first of all, I think the time it takes to change is quite substantial. So in Finnish case, I would say we have now spent maybe 2 decades total in sort of trying to this. Of course, in the 90s, it was still, people didn't speak so much about creative economy. But I think the roots were laid there, and especially then in the telecom boom or internet bubble that we had in the late 1990s. That's when the first attempts were made. At that time, also international venture capitalists came in. Now, I think this is the first learning. You cannot do this type of change by isolating your country. By only focusing on Finland alone, the government could not have achieved this kind of change. A key element was to invite international venture capitalists, and also Nokia brought a lot of international players into the country because of the brand and image of being leading in mobile technology. Second element then for me was that, in fact, the large companies, their role is very critical here. And very often, a large company has difficulties helping to create this creative economy. Because the large company and the people in those large companies, their focus is really on their own success and their careers. And these startup companies have a very different culture. So one might even say that there is some kind of jealousy or cultural barrier between these type of companies. So of course, in a big company, the big company tries to get the ideas, but they are maybe not so interested in buying or acquiring those companies and making the entrepreneurs rich. This is something that Silicon Valley has done very well. In Silicon Valley, there's no jealousy. The large companies are always buying entrepreneurs and buying up the companies, and entrepreneurs become wealthy. So there's a clear motive to be an entrepreneur. In Finland, Nokia was not very active in buying companies. I was a venture capitalist at that time. We had a venture capital fund called Stratos Ventures, and we met with Nokia many times with our portfolio companies. We had about 15 portfolio companies. But in fact, none of these companies were ever sold to Nokia. So Nokia was very strict about not buying Finnish companies. They did buy foreign companies. some people were saying that this kind of barrier existed because Nokia people did not want to make the Finnish entrepreneurs successful because there was a fear that people from Nokia would leave and create startups and then sell them back to Nokia. So they tried to prevent that. But I think this, and that I think was a mistake. We should have been more active in fostering this kind of people leaving and creating entrepreneurship and coming back. I think in Korea, one of the challenges is that we need the best talent in our entrepreneurial companies and our startups. But right now, the large companies pull all the best talent from the universities into their career path. Many of these people could actually do a better job if they would be a member of a startup team. They could be more creative, more innovative. So the venture capital companies and the government has a role in trying to make sure that some of the talent goes into the startup arena and finds that career as interesting. So how to take along the large companies into the ecosystem so that they are really sort of being part of it rather than just trying to sort of keep their own, that's a critical thing to look at. And I think the government needs to follow that and have an honest and open discussion about that. Hopefully it does not require a crisis where somebody like Samsung or Hyundai really has to come down before the economy opens. So I'm really hopeful that Korea can find a way which is a little bit different than Finland. I hope Korea, here we don't have to experience the same kind of Nokia crisis as we had to experience in Finland to achieve this change. Of course, in the long term, I think that Korea also needs to take a look at IP regulations and IP legislation. Korea is behind in this area compared to Finland, and I think that is one of the key areas for government policy. And it will be a tough route. Final lesson learned, the political parties need to collaborate. Yeah, of course. Today, I think we are talking about creative economy, and personally I'm very pleased that this has been taken as a theme by the administration. But if I look at the press today in Korea and the political discussion going on, the discussion is still maybe a little bit too far from real actions. There are a lot of discussion about topics which are maybe secondary. Now, to be honest, the Korean economy is facing some real challenges. Yeah, we have the leading companies like Hyundai and Samsung, but behind that, it's a big gap of finding really successful global companies who can take their technology on a global arena. And I think, therefore, the political parties really should start thinking seriously about creative economy together and find ways to collaborate. I'm very optimistic about this. Korea has a huge neighboring countries with huge markets, and Korea can play a very critical role in that. So you have an attractive close market nearby. Maybe the Korean companies don't need to go to the US or Europe. They can actually find something here. But also with the FDAs now in place, Latin America and Europe and US can be secondary markets as well. So that's at least, there is an opportunity.
Yes, I think it sounds like Korea and really Finland is a very similar situation. Like we have our economy is based on the big companies.
Right.
Yeah, big where most of the economies depends on the big companies. But unfortunately, Finland experienced big companies collapse, and then you had to find your own way.
Right.
I wish Korea can find our own way without that kind of crisis. So, yes. I mean, in doing that, as you mentioned, like political collaborations and government collaboration, those are the very important role. And you mentioned about like a globalization. And now I also believe that globalization is really important because the Korean market itself is not big. So we need to be globalized. So could you mention about like a globalization issues?
Right. Well, Korean market is relatively small, but you have to remember Korea is still 10 times larger than Finland. Finland is 5 million and Korea is 50 million. So even Seoul is twice Finland. And I think for Finnish companies, our small domestic market has been a benefit because it has made our companies immediately global. We cannot really sell locally. Personally, I was the CEO of a fiber optics company, so we had a fiber manufacturing plant. And I didn't have a single customer in Finland. My closest customer was in Germany. So I had to really go global immediately with that company. And I think for Korean startups, and I mentioned this in an earlier article as well, the challenge is that many Korean companies, they see a reasonable opportunity in the home market and they start there. But then they sort of get captured by that home market and they don't really push abroad. So I think it is important that the government really makes these entrepreneurs think global from the start. So in Europe we talk about born global startup companies, and emphasizing the nature of born global in the Korean ecosystem I think is very important. The other thing is of course that it would be smart for Koreans to have also foreign VCs and venture capitalists participating. There are many mechanisms for this. For example, Israel has made it a very successful model where they have local venture capitalists and American venture capitalists collaborating, and that by making sure that it's not dominated by one or the other, but there is a healthy balance. And I think in Finland we are seeing the same now. We have a big startup and technology conference called Slush, and that attracts both foreign and local investors and startups. I think you saw on your trip to Finland that there was a lot of European startups coming to Helsinki to experience that environment. If Seoul can become such an international environment or hotbed for the Asian startup companies, that would be a tremendous situation, and it would definitely boost the Korean economy forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Seoul as a kind of a startup, home of startup companies in at least East Asia or as a world as a whole. So, okay, yeah, I think that we talk most of the issues like similarity and situation in Finland before and now, and moving toward the creative economy and globalization. Anything you want to mention or give a kind of advice to Korea creative economy as a kind of summary or final word?
Well, I think that these two countries, Finland and Korea, one might say that, oh, what chance has a small country in this world? Because the large countries, they will dominate. But I think what one forgets in such a situation is that easily that these small countries are very fast and very nimble. And you know, Korea and Finland, they are now leading in education. We have the highest scores. Of course, there are other countries as well, but like Singapore. But also there, you know, I think that small countries have a benefit that it is actually easy to implement change, or easier to implement change in these small countries. So they are faster and more nimble. Also, it is quite amazing how successful both Korea and Finland have been in the technology field. Again, it shows that if you are able to attract the top talent and if you are focusing your efforts, even a small country can achieve quite magnificent results. You know, having the two leading or formerly leading company like Nokia and now the leading company like Samsung coming from these small countries is really amazing in my opinion. And I think that these smaller countries, you know, we have a role in the global economy. We can lead the way and do experiments which the large countries cannot do. We are faster and more flexible. The nation is also easier to be guided in some new directions. Second of all, I think these small countries make an ideal partner for other countries. So we are very neutral. From that perspective, I see that the smaller countries definitely have an important mission in trying to lead the way in terms of globalization, but also in creative economy and entrepreneurial activity. And I think the world now is increasingly, like they say, the world is flat. Because of the internet and such, you can work and you can be an entrepreneur anywhere on the planet. That's why places like Helsinki or Seoul can be very important centers for the development of new technology and new ecosystem styles. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we have a fruitful discussions. I wish we can learn from the Finland creative economy. Also, we can avoid some mistakes you already did. So I think we have a lot of things we can collaborate each other in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. 네, 핀란드는 그 북반구의 반대쪽에 있지만은 저희와 상당히 비슷한 면도 많이 있고 우리가 또 배울 것들이 많이 있고 또 함께 창조경제를 같이 가져갈 그런 어떤 동반자 역할도 될 수 있으라고 생각합니다. 오늘 말씀해 주신 스테니우스 박사님께 감사드립니다. 예, 감사합니다. 예.
감사합니다.